start it up. Did I do that right? Hold on a second. Pause recording. Okay. All right. So we're recording. All right. So we're going to talk about the Renaissance today. And so this is in some ways is kind of different from all of the art historical lectures that we've had up to this point. Like so far, with each art history topic that I've introduced, we started with Paleolithic and Neolithic art, then we had kind of ancient, the art of ancient civilizations, and then we had the art of classical Greece, and a little bit going into the Roman period, and then we had the art of early Christian art leading into medieval art. With each of those topics, primarily the content was kind of the history, and there was just a small amount of actual artworks to look at, not enough to really make it. I mean, there were some exceptions. Like, let's say in the Greek lecture where we were looking at red figure and black figure, we have enough examples of artwork where we can just really concentrate on the changes in style, almost separate from the topic of the changes in society and the changes of like one culture versus the next culture. But primarily, what we have been looking at is we've been looking at kind of historical changes and just getting little snapshots of artwork that kind of represent and show us some of those changes. But when we get to the Renaissance, we have such an enormous body of artwork to look at. It really, I mean, there's still stuff we can talk about in terms of how these cultures were developing and changing, but it's much more an art historical lecture because it's really focused just on the art and the changes in the art that sometimes happen because of changes in society, but sometimes it's happened because of changes in style. So that's in some ways a little bit different. And like normal, I have kind of like a title page here where I'm bringing up some of the main topics we're going to be talking about and breaking down the main way that the lecture is organized. And and then we have here a lot of artwork to look at. So that gives us a clue as to what we're going to be looking at in the rest of the lecture. So let's go to the first page. So starting with the beginnings, the very, very beginnings of the Renaissance are seen in Italy in a period that you could call the late Gothic, but a lot of people tend to call the Proto-Renaissance, right? This kind of pre-period before the start of the early Renaissance, but where there's so much more art being made and the ambition of the art is increasing. And so like artists like Duccio is very much, like the artists of the Renaissance were they admired Duccio. They were very influenced by Duccio. So they didn't see him as being part of the distant past. But he is technically part of the Gothic, technically, right? And not part of the Renaissance in terms of how we date it, and that we start the dating for the early Renaissance at 1400. But nonetheless, we have to understand that the roots of the Renaissance actually go a whole 100 years um, earlier, and that it isn't so much a immediate and dramatic change; it's a gradual change from the styles and aesthetics of Gothic painting in Italy into the Renaissance painting. And probably no one represents that transition better than Giotto, who if you'd asked the Renaissance painters who the first Renaissance artist was, if they even recognized the term Renaissance, but if you asked them like who's the first great painter of Italy, if you'd asked Michelangelo or if you asked Leonardo, they would have all said Giotto. And Giotto kind of like is in some ways in the same world as Duccio, this kind of formal, iconographic, like influenced by Eastern Orthodox icon painting. It's much flatter, but there's still this rounding of form, and we're using hierarchical scale. And Giotto is still in that world. We can see that very much in like his Madonna Enthroned, where he's still kind of using hierarchical scale, in that Madonna herself is much larger than the angels. But then when we look at his painting for the Lamentations, he did a whole series like just filled the chapel. Scrivani Chapel is just filled with these Giotto frescoes. And, and this is a fresco, by the way, which is painting on plaster, and we'll get to that in the painting lecture. And so you can kind of see the hints as to where the Renaissance is going. Now, in this painting, everyone's kind of on a believable sort of platform, sort of a stage-like space. And although it doesn't seem like there's quite enough space for all these figures to be standing in there, there seems to be an effort to try to make everything look like it all shares in one kind of coherent place and space. And and all the figures are approximately of naturalistic scale, right? That they mostly just change to each other in terms of like which one's closer to us versus further away, and they also change a little bit based off of like this one was a bigger person, like he was taller than him, kind of thing, but not in terms of this person's more important. Um, so this person needs to be twice the size, kind of thing. And so starting at 1400, with the influence of artists like Duccio and Giotto, we begin this transition into the early Renaissance. And probably one of the first artists to look at is Masaccio. And Masaccio's painting here, the Holy Trinity, is is a very bold beginning of the Renaissance. This use of perspective space to make this kind of trompe l'oeil effect where we're looking into the architecture of the building, but it's um, just a flat painting. So the use of perspective space, the use of foreshortening where the figures are kind of like changing in scale based on how they fit in the perspective space is yeah, and just the quality of the figure drawing and of the painting is very much more of the Renaissance than it is of the proto-Renaissance or the late Gothic period that we see before. And so we see a lot of painting, and that's one of the things that's especially unique about the Renaissance is just there's so much artwork to look at. If we go back for a second, we think about one of the main questions is whether the Renaissance was as extraordinary, as important as we kind of believe it is, like when we're telling the story of the history, like we tend to imagine the Renaissance as being extremely important. And my answer to that is, to a degree, it is true. And one of my pieces of evidence for that is that it is that there was just so much artwork to be made. Okay, moving on. So on this page, there's a lot to look at, but especially the most important one to know is David's Donatello. And we'll see this again and again. We've already seen it a couple of times in the lecture on sculpture. It came up. If you remember, there was one page where I paired David's Donatello with Michelangelo's or Donatello's David with Michelangelo's David with Bernini's David. And so David's Donatello is bronze. It's cast bronze, and it's a freestanding figure. And it has been claimed, I can't find any, I think it's probably true that it's been claimed that Donatello's David is the first freestanding figurative cast bronze sculpture made post the end of the Roman Empire, post the end of antiquity. So, and therefore the first of the Renaissance. And it's not fully life size. It's maybe about half life size. It's on but it is a beautiful piece, and yeah, it comes up a lot. So, and there's a lot you can say. I mean, besides what we just covered about it being freestanding, I would count it as in the round and bronze cast sculpture. We can also mention the fact that it is a great example of contrapposto. Okay, so further going into the early Renaissance, we have artists like Piero della Francesca, who's one of my absolute favorites. And he really kind of expanded both in terms of the ambition of these kind of multi-figure scenes and thinking about really observing figures, kind of like what people actually do when they're working on stuff, right? Um, and but also his like his portraiture in frescoes and in public buildings, like his paintings of various saints are just amazing. So I picked this one of Saint Augustine as a really good example of that kind of the way he's using the value contrast, what's called chiaroscuro, which is the modeling using a large amount of change from light to dark. The way he's using that, right, like through the head, right, and the way he's using just um, the attention to the detail on the cloth um, and his understanding of figure drawing just allows the that portrait to really feel very solid, tangible. So at the same time that the early Renaissance was going on in Italy, there was there was trends happening in Northern Europe. And let's go back to the starting page again to see one of my other points. So one of my main points is that there are really two Renaissances, right? There's the Northern European Renaissance and the Renaissance in Italy. And then on top of that, that there was really the early Renaissance and the late, or otherwise known as high Renaissance. We see the distinction of early and high Renaissance more clearly in Italy than we do in Europe, in that what we call the Northern European Renaissance started a lot later and was more just kind of like a general flow from one to the other. Okay, so in Northern Europe, we have a slightly different tradition developing. And if we look at this painting by Robert Campin, we see much more like it's a great painting and it's really kind of telling us where we're going into the Renaissance, but it's also more tied to the Gothic, right? With this kind of like slightly almost isometric space. See the way like this table is kind of upturned. There's artificiality to it and a kind of a flattening of space that feels more like the Gothic and less like the Renaissance. But what is happening here is the use of these really kind of the soft modeling of tone everywhere, and and at the same time we have another artist, Jan van Eyck, and Jan van Eyck is generally the artist credited with inventing oil painting, and so like uh, this painting here is technically not an oil painting. It's an egg tempera, but it has some varnishes of oil on top. But this painting here, the self-portrait, is an oil painting. And whoop, go back. So we're not exactly sure how the tradition of oil painting was invented, and I'll get into that in more depth in the lecture on painting. But we know it happened here, somewhere in the Northern European Renaissance, somewhere in this group that involved people like Jan van Eyck and Robert Campin. And we're pretty sure between the two Van Eyck brothers, because um, that that was where it was invented. And so the invention of it comes out of this tradition of working in tempera painting. And then these Northern European artists had gotten used to the idea of doing these kind of oil varnishes over the tempera painting to seal it. And they'd also gotten used to this idea of, in these oil varnishes, kind of tinting them with color. And so this is all you need to do from there is to learn that if you really grind the paint into the oil, you can actually make paint that's, not just pigment suspended in oil, but a true paint, a true solution, to use the scientific term, the difference between a suspension and a solution, for those of you who remember chemistry. Anyway, so here's Jan van Eyck. We see and we'll talk about the Arnolfini wedding portrait a number of times, and so it'll come up again. And then as we get into the High Renaissance, the artist that most dominated the Northern European High Renaissance was Albrecht Dürer. And especially in printmaking, Dürer was a master printmaker and made just so much artwork on the printmaking side. But he was also a pretty awesome painter, an oil painter as well. We will see a lot more of Dürer when we get to the lecture on printmaking, and we'll talk about that some more. And this particular print, which is Night and the Devil, is an engraving, which is pretty amazing. Um, sorry for, I've got a lawnmower outside my window. And it's an engraving, and it's a really good example. I use it in comparison between like different ways of creating value. Um, so I often pair that with like a Baroque painting where there's a lot of really extreme, but we could similarly compare it to here, where there's a lot of extreme value contrast. The darks are much, so like in this one, the range is a little bit more narrow. But the main difference is the way the value is created, because this is a engraving. Every single amount of value is created out of like multiple lines building up darker and darker values. Okay, so going back to Italy, we're getting towards the end of the early Renaissance, and oftentimes we say that the High Renaissance starts about 1480, and but then is Montaigne's Lamentation of Dead Christ, is that High Renaissance or early Renaissance? Is Botticelli's High Renaissance or early Renaissance? That's kind of a bit of a judgment call, but definitely by the time we get to artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael, we're definitely into the High Renaissance. But before we get to those big three, let me show you. Like, so here's the big three: Leonardo, right? And Leonardo is probably he's the main reason why we date the High Renaissance to the 1480s instead of dating it at 1500, because he made some pretty amazing paintings between 1480 and 1500 that were very much part of the High Renaissance. So everyone else, like Raphael and Michelangelo, like most of the great work was done after 1500. Okay, but getting back, I want to talk about Del Sarto for a second. So I picked Del Sarto to be a stand-in for all of the thing about the High Renaissance is we tend to focus on the big three, like Michelangelo, Leonardo, and and Raphael. We focus on them because they're well known and because there's so much artwork to look at. But one thing to remember is that there were so many other artists with incredibly successful careers who were making amazing paintings. So I picked Del Sarto here to kind of be a stand-in for all those others. I mean, Del Sarto was truly a fantastic painter and a great artist. And a lot of people also felt like he was a really great guy. He was well liked. And we will see like that there's a lot of influence from Del Sarto on later paintings. Like when we look at the paintings of Titian, Titian probably was as influenced by Del Sarto as he was by uh, like Michelangelo. So the big three, like I said, Leonardo da Vinci. And so here I'm just showing kind of a grid of a whole bunch of artwork that some that are well known, like Mona Lisa or The Last Supper, and some that are not so well known. I included a lot of images from his sketchbooks in here, other drawings. So this is of all the Leonardo paintings, the Virgin of the Rocks, especially the Paris, the Louvre version, is the one that I will be returning to the most, just because there's only so many things I can ask you to memorize, and I decided that this one is kind of the one that represents everything that's kind of like great and amazing and particularly unique about Leonardo in one painting. And it is a beautiful, amazing painting. It's a shame that it's well. And the other, so besides Leonardo, also you need to know Raphael, and probably the most important one you need to know of Raphael is the School of Athens. We'll be talking about the School of Athens a number of times. We'll talk about it when we discuss perspective because of the use of a one-point perspective system in it. We'll talk about it when I have my lecture on um, fresco painting. I'm talking about fresco painting because it's an example of fresco painting. And yeah, and I think the thing to know about it right now is so Raphael was asked to do this particular fresco painting in the Vatican in a room not that far away from where Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Chapel, right? And in this space, he had a series of frescoes doing, and this is the most famous one of that set. And this was also about the same time when he was doing Galatea. And in this fresco painting, one of the reasons why it's really important is that it represents kind of that the Renaissance was trying to grapple with the idea of the classical inheritance, right? The thing to remember is that Renaissance Italy was Catholic and it was very religious. It was very Christian. And but at the same time, it was more and more interested in the achievements of antiquity, like specifically of classical Greece and classical Rome, including classical Greece and classical Rome that was pre-Christian. And and so there were lots of artworks that were being discovered. So right around this time that Laocoon was discovered in Italy. It was buried in the ground. Someone pulled it out. So artworks, ruins were being discovered, works of architecture, works of sculpture, really no painting. It wasn't until the 19th century that we really started to discover Roman paintings. But anyway, um, and also works of literature. There was and works of philosophy, and so there was this inheritance from the Greeks and Romans that the Renaissance was trying to acknowledge and trying to find a way to um, try to kind of like combine it. And so the Pope commissioned this painting to be a representation of the big schools of philosophy. And so in it, we have on one side the philosophy of Plato, and then all the people who are influenced by Plato, the Platonists and the Neoplatonists, and all those others who are kind of influenced from. And then on the other side, we have Aristotle and all the philosophers who are influenced by Aristotle. And, and then we also have Socrates here, who is the philosopher that influenced and taught both um, Aristotle and Plato. And so it's basically the whole school, the whole of all Greek philosophy, because although it starts in Athens, many of these people were not Athenians. They lived in Alexandria or other Greek cities in the Hellenistic world, but they were just influenced by these Athenian philosophers. So anyway, what this represents is kind of like trying to find a marriage between the philosophy and the morality of Christianity of that period, Renaissance Catholic Christianity, trying to marry that with the inheritance of Greek philosophy. And you can see kind of a similar sort of marrying in Dante's Inferno, where Dante has a level of hell that is specifically for the virtuous pagans, right? Like the people like these philosophers who lived a good, proper life, taught people well, right? But they just happen to live in a pre-Christ period. And so their level of hell is basically not punishment. They're just, they're hanging out. Because Dante thought it would be like, it would be incomprehensible that God would punish these great philosophers just because they happen to live before the time of Christ. Um, and so there's a similar kind of like trying to find a way to marry these ideas and make them compatible. Okay, and lastly, Michelangelo Buonarroti, and here is the Sistine Chapel. And we'll talk about the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is also an example of fresco painting, and but probably of all of Michelangelo's. That's a good question. I, some 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 of these might show up as extra credits, and David usually shows up as an extra credit. But I frequently don't have Michelangelo actually represented on like the final exam. But you never know. Okay, now we discussed the big three, but there is one other chapter of the Italian Renaissance that often gets um, shortchanged or left aside, which is that while all of this was going on, like Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo were primarily in the northern part of Italy on the eastern side. And so in the region between Milan, Florence, and Rome. And they were all very much influenced by, especially like the large amount of money and patronage in Florence and Milan and Rome, right? Many of them came from some of like Leonardo comes from a small little town called Vinci. That's why he's Da Vinci. Um, Many of them came from small kind of like villages like Padua and stuff around these areas, but it was the economy of Milan, Florence, and Rome that really kind of ran things. But on the oh, this is the western side. I'm sorry, I said eastern side. And this is all going on the western side of Italy. But on the eastern side of Italy, we have a very different city that is very influential, and that is Venice. And Venice is very different because Venice, being on the eastern side and being a port city, is much more connected to the east, connected to the Eastern Orthodox Church, connected to um, the Byzantine Empire, and even to the Islamic world. Like traders, like merchants in Venice were had merchant deals all over the Mediterranean world. So Venice was in some ways a more cosmopolitan city than Rome in some certain ways, but also just different. And there was more of an influence from the Northern European styles of oil painting coming into Venice a little bit earlier than there was in the Western side, where we have Milan and uh, Florence and Rome. And so Venice kind of develops its own separate tradition. It starts with Bellini, who Bellini is kind of a similar figure to Del Sarto. Everyone loved him, and he was a great painter, but not maybe not quite brilliant in the same way that some of the others were, but a solid painter and made great paintings. And we will talk about Bellini's St. Francis in Ecstasy, otherwise known as St. Francis in the Wilderness. We'll talk about that one a number of times. It'll come up a lot in a number of lectures. So Bellini was important. And one of his students was Giorgione, and Giorgione really brought this um, kind of married the Northern European tradition of oil painting with the achievements that Michelangelo, or no, that Leonardo was developing in oil painting. Ooh, I do need to go back. Hold on a second. I skipped the point. So there's a term you need to know here. We already covered chiaroscuro, which means light and dark, and is the basic kind of Renaissance idea of how everything needs to be kind of modeled from a light to a dark with a consistent light source, right? Like that we can really believe that light's coming from somewhere, um, from over here to there and illuminating these forms. And everything has this relatively soft modeled modulation of value on it. It's a kind of an idealized version of what value is actually doing when we have light shining on objects. Okay, that's chiaroscuro. But the other term you need to know, which until we get to Giorgione, is really a term that only applies to Leonardo. And that's the term sfumato, which means smoke-like, and has to do with Leonardo's specific technique of working in very kind of thin smoke-like layers to further this modeling, and also to kind of like put things in further back. So not only to use it for the modeling and the lights and darks, but also to use it to kind of like push some things deeper into the space and make them feel more like they're in the painting. Like, and you can see the difference between like the way Raphael is painting, right? Here he's primarily using a change in temperature to really create that sense of of atmospheric perspective of things going back in space. Whereas Leonardo is using much more of this kind of layering of these kind of darker kind of washes of tone as a way to kind of push things back further in space. And when we get to Giorgione, he kind of like has a similar sort of approach, working in kind of some thin layers, uh, and and that's very influential on another student who both studied with Bellini, but also for a brief time studied under Giorgione, and that is Titian. And Titian is really the other, of the three greats, right? Titian is the other great. In fact, I would say in some ways Titian is the greatest of all Italian Renaissance artists, the most influential by far. Like we think, well, Leonardo and Michelangelo must have been the most influential, but really especially on the Baroque, but even on the Mannerists, the artists who came immediately after the Renaissance, it was Titian and Titian's kind of manner of painting that really was most influential. And at first, Titian doesn't seem that different from his contemporaries, right? Like this painting here or that painting doesn't seem like it's that far away from what like Del Sarto is doing. Just a little bit better, right? and smoother and polished, but also kind of like a little bit less forced, right? It's much more natural. He was a virtuosic painter, meaning that like he did it quickly and gesturally. Doesn't look gestural from our point of view, but it was, and especially it got more gestural as we went on. So at this stage, he's definitely the best painter in Italy, and definitely the really, from that from the Western world sort of point of view, he's the best painter of Europe. But it's the end period that's truly amazing, and in these later periods where he's allowing himself to be a lot more loose and expressive, and but also then this layering of kind of like stains of color to make the to make everything, all these different gestural marks kind of sit in this space. It's just very beautiful. Okay, and that's the end of my lecture on the Renaissance. And I did it in about half an hour, which is pretty good. So, Anna, do you have any questions? Can you say them out loud? Or, oh, you're on a road trip at the moment, so I can't use my mic. Okay. So, do you have any questions about anything about that having to do with the Renaissance? Um, No questions. Okay. Does that, like, the goal was, I mean, I had to go through that fast. I could have done that lecture three times longer than it is. I mean, certainly like in our art history class, you would generally spend like three class periods just going through the history of the Renaissance, like one for the early Italian Renaissance, one for the Northern European Renaissance, and one for the High Renaissance easily. But for our purposes, it had to be very kind of brief, but I wanted it to give you kind of like a clear understanding of how all these things kind of related. If you look at the notes, there's a lot more discussion, and especially the discussion of the notes. There's a lot more discussion of things like why did the Renaissance happen, and how do we explain that, and how do we judge how influential the Renaissance was, and also a lot more information on just like the basic dates. Um, but is there anything you wanted more information on before we end this lecture? All right, you're good. Okay, well, excellent. I'm going to stop share here, and you have a good rest of your trip. And I will see you later. And like I said, there will be a 12:30 later today, and that the primary thing we'll be talking about. We might talk about painting, but the main thing we're going to be talking about is the paper, and then the same with tonight. And I might, if I'm lucky, I might be able to squeeze in an afternoon lecture as well, just to cover more of Unit 5. Okay. All right. Well, you have a good rest trip, and I'll see you later.